cat changed everything this season. Karl-Anthony Towns' stats tell one of the most fascinating transformation stories in recent NBA history, and the numbers genuinely don't lie here. Let's start with where it all began. Towns came into the league in 2015 as the #1 overall pick, and he was immediately putting up numbers that made everyone's jaw drop. 18.3 points per game as a rookie, 54% shooting from the field, 10.5 rebounds per game. He won Rookie of the Year unanimously, which doesn't happen often at all. And then by his second season, he jumped all the way past 25 points per game. At 21 years old, he was already producing offensive numbers that most players never reach at their peak. Think about that for a second. 21 years old, and he's already putting up numbers that veterans with 10 years of experience dream about hitting. And the shooting numbers were just ridiculous from the start. Towns became the first center in NBA history to win the three-point contest. That's not a ceremonial thing or some kind of participation trophy. He was legitimately one of the best volume shooters in basketball, regardless of position. Not one of the best centers, one of the best shooters in the entire league, period. That's how extraordinary the offensive numbers were during his Minnesota years. Before Nikola Jokic became a multiple-time MVP, before Wemby entered the league, before centers routinely pulling up from 30 feet became a normal thing people expected. Towns was already doing all of it, and the numbers backed up every single bit of it. His shooting profile was unlike anything the league had seen from a center at that point. He could shoot off the catch, he could shoot off movement, he could shoot off pick and pop actions, he could attack closeouts. The percentages stayed elite across all of those different shot types, which is genuinely difficult to maintain. A lot of players can shoot well from one spot or one action. Maintaining elite shooting percentages across multiple shot types and multiple situations is a completely different level of skill, and the numbers showed it consistently throughout his Minnesota tenure. By age 24, Towns had already been a two-time All-Star. The offensive resume was building into something historic. He was developing into arguably the greatest shooting big man the league had ever seen at that point in time. The statistical case for that argument was legitimate. His scoring numbers, his shooting percentages, his three-point volume, his ability to score from the post, off the dribble, off movement, all of it combined to create a statistical profile that hadn't really existed in the NBA before for a player his size. But here's where it gets really interesting, because for all those incredible offensive stats, the defense numbers were telling a completely different story on the other side of the ball. Minnesota's defense was consistently worse with Towns on the floor than off it. That's one of the most brutal stats a star player can carry. It means the team was literally playing better defense without their best offensive player on the court. Year after year, that number kept showing up in the analytics, and it became one of the defining statistics of his entire Minnesota tenure. You couldn't have a serious conversation about Towns' statistical profile without that number coming up, because it was always there, sitting right next to all the impressive offensive production. The on-off defense splits were a consistent talking point throughout his time in Minnesota. Coaches tried different approaches, different systems, different defensive assignments. The results kept pointing in the same direction. The team's defense was easier to attack with Towns on the floor, and the numbers reflected that reality over and over again across multiple seasons. The foul numbers made the defense situation even more complicated. At one point, Towns led the entire NBA in personal fouls, led the entire league. For a player of his caliber, that's an enormous problem, because it meant he was constantly being pulled off the floor during critical moments when Minnesota needed him most. And many of those fouls weren't the result of physical limitations or guys just being stronger than him. They were reaching fouls, bad angle fouls, frustration fouls, overhelping fouls, the kind that show up in the film room and make coaches shake their heads because they're so preventable. The kind that tell you the decision making on defense wasn't where it needed to be. Those foul numbers followed him for years and became a massive part of why the advanced defense metrics never looked good with him on the floor. You can't anchor a defense when you're constantly sitting on the bench in foul trouble. The combination of those two statistical realities, the negative defense on off splits and the league-leading personal foul numbers, created a unique situation where one of the most offensively gifted players in basketball was simultaneously one of the most statistically damaging defenders among star players. That contradiction defined how people analyzed his numbers for the better part of a decade. Analysts would pull up his offensive stats and then immediately pull up the defense numbers to show the other side of the story, and both sets of numbers were accurate, which made it genuinely difficult to evaluate what his presence on the floor was actually worth in total. Then the Rudy Gobert trade happened in 2022, and the stats started shifting in a way that told a new story. For the first time in his career, Towns didn't have to anchor the defense by himself. Gobert handled the rim protection numbers, the paint defense statistics, the interior rotations. And what happened when that responsibility was taken off Towns' plate? His individual defense metrics started quietly improving. It wasn't dramatic overnight, but observers started noticing the trends. His positioning was getting better. His foul numbers started coming down from those league-leading totals. He was making smarter reads on defense, and the numbers were beginning to reflect it. The foundation of the transformation that everyone would later talk about in New York was actually being built in Minnesota during those final seasons with the Timberwolves. That part of the story doesn't get enough attention when people discuss the statistical transformation, because it's easy to credit New York with all of it. But the groundwork was laid before he ever put on a Knicks uniform. The defensive improvements in those final Minnesota seasons weren't massive statistical jumps. They were incremental, better positioning percentages, fewer gambling mistakes that showed up as opponent easy baskets, more disciplined rim contests that didn't result in fouls. Timberwolves fans who tracked the detailed numbers started noticing that Towns stopped going for the highlight block as aggressively and started holding his ground more consistently. That sounds like a small adjustment, but the statistical ripple effects of staying square to offensive players instead of opening your hips and chasing blocks are significant. It leads to fewer fouls. It leads to better defense positioning. It leads to opponents getting less comfortable attacking you. All of that started showing up in small ways during his final Minnesota seasons. The NBA Finals are here, and if you're anything like me, every possession suddenly feels like it carries the weight of basketball history. The good news is the action doesn't stop with the finals. This summer is packed with sports, and Prize Picks is making it even more fun to follow along. One thing I really like about Prize Picks is how simple it is. I can make my picks on NBA playoff action by selecting more or less on 2 to 6 player stats, things like points, rebounds, assists, threes, or fantasy score, then track everything right in the app. It gives every game a little extra juice without overcomplicating things. And with the 2026 NBA Finals, legacies are on the line. Make your picks on the biggest NBA games of the season before a champion is crowned. Prize Picks is a preferred partner of the NBA. Download the app today and use code CLNS to get $50 instantly in lineups when you play your first $5 lineup. Download the app today and use code CLNS to get $50 instantly in lineups when you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, a preferred partner of the NBA. And then Anthony Edwards emerged as Minnesota's new franchise centerpiece. And something really interesting happened to Towns' numbers. His usage rate started declining. In basketball, usage rate measures how many of a team's possessions end with a particular player shooting, drawing fouls, or turning the ball over. When you're the franchise centerpiece and everything runs through you, that number is high. As Edwards took over as the team's primary option, Towns' usage naturally decreased, and instead of his efficiency dropping the way it does for so many stars when their role shrinks, his efficiency stayed at an elite level. That's actually a critically important statistical signal. Efficiency staying high when usage drops means a player is finding ways to maximize fewer possessions rather than forcing things to maintain their numbers. It means the decision making is improving. It means the shot selection is getting smarter. Towns was learning how to be excellent in a different way, and the efficiency numbers were showing it even before New York. Now, when he arrived in New York before the 2024-25 season, the numbers started doing things that nobody in the analytical community had really predicted based on his career trajectory. His defensive rating improved significantly compared to his Minnesota years. Defensive rating measures how many points a team allows per 100 possessions with a specific player on the floor. For most of Towns' career, that number was a liability, something to work around, something that opponent coaching staffs tried to exploit. In New York, it started becoming a strength, or at minimum, it stopped being a weakness that opponents could reliably target. His foul numbers came down in a meaningful way from those Minnesota totals. That might sound like a relatively minor statistical adjustment, but in terms of actual impact on winning basketball, it's enormous. Fewer fouls means more minutes. More minutes in high leverage situations, more possessions where the Knicks, could deploy their best lineup without having to manage his foul count. The discipline improvement showed up directly in his availability statistics. And availability is genuinely one of the most underrated numbers in basketball analysis. A superstar who plays 40 minutes matters more than a superstar who plays 25 minutes because of foul trouble, even if their per minute numbers are identical. The overall team defense numbers with Towns on the floor improved substantially from his Minnesota on-off splits. Instead of the team bleeding points when he was on the court defensively, New York's defense held up. The collective defensive system the Knicks built around him helped, but the individual discipline numbers also changed, and you can't separate the two things. Better individual decisions contributed to better team defense numbers, and the data showed both things moving in the right direction simultaneously. But the playoff stats are where the transformation really becomes completely undeniable, because regular season numbers can be somewhat explained away by opponent quality or game situation. Playoff numbers are different. Playoff opponents are the best teams in basketball. Playoff coaches are scheming specifically to exploit your weaknesses. Playoff numbers are the most honest reflection of what a player actually is. And Towns' playoff numbers in 2026 told a story that his Minnesota postseason statistics never came close to telling. His assist numbers absolutely exploded in these playoffs. His playoff assists more than doubled compared to his regular season average. Let that sink in for a moment. His assists more than double. In the playoffs, when defenses get tighter and passing windows get smaller, and defenses are specifically designed to take away what you want to do, his passing numbers went up dramatically in exactly the environment where you'd expect them to be hardest to produce. And here's the part that's genuinely hard to wrap your head around. Statistically, he actually led the Knicks in playoff assists, a center, on a team with Jalen Brunson, one of the best offensive point guards in basketball. Towns led the team in assists. That's one of the most statistically unusual achievements for a player of his position in recent playoff history. And it happened because the offense was legitimately running through him at the elbow and high post in ways that created real problems for opposing defenses. The triple-double numbers in these playoffs backed up the passing statistics in a concrete way. Against Atlanta, Towns recorded the first playoff triple-double of his entire career. After more than 10 years in the league, the first one came in these playoffs. And then he did it again in the same series. 2 playoff triple-doubles against the same opponent in a single series. When you think about a player who spent nearly a decade being evaluated almost exclusively through his scoring numbers, suddenly producing back-to-back triple-doubles in the postseason based largely on his passing and rebounding contributions, that represents a fundamental and measurable statistical shift in how he was impacting basketball games. The box score finally started reflecting the full picture of what he was doing, rather than just the scoring column. His advanced impact metrics during the playoffs ranked him near the very top of the postseason leaderboards across both offensive and defensive measurements at the same time. That combination is genuinely rare in NBA analytics. Most star players who show up near the top of offensive metrics are somewhere in the middle or lower on defense metrics. Showing up near the top of both simultaneously during the highest pressure basketball of the year puts Towns in a very small group of players league-wide for a guy whose defense was the first criticism anyone mentioned when his name came up for almost an entire decade. That statistical placement in the 2026 playoffs represents one of the most dramatic individual statistical turnarounds the league has seen from an established star. The scoring efficiency numbers stayed at an elite level throughout all of this transformation, which is the other critically important statistical point that deserves emphasis. His efficiency didn't drop when his usage rate dropped in New York. His efficiency didn't fall off when the offense stopped revolving around him the way it did during his peak Minnesota seasons. His efficiency didn't decline when his role changed fundamentally from primary scorer to secondary creator. He was doing more different things at a high statistical level while also maintaining the offensive production numbers that made him valuable in the first place. That combination is genuinely hard to achieve. Most players who take on expanded passing and defense responsibilities see their offensive efficiency dip at least somewhat. Towns maintained his offensive numbers while adding the other statistical contributions, and that's what makes the overall profile so unique. His ability to impact games without being the primary scorer became statistically measurable in ways that simply didn't exist in his game earlier in his career. Screen assists, which measure how often a player's screens directly lead to scoring opportunities for teammates, became a meaningful and trackable part of his contribution to the Knicks' offensive numbers. Offensive rebounding statistics stayed strong and created second chance opportunities that showed up in the team's overall offensive efficiency. His defensive communication and positioning improvements showed up in the team's collective defense rating during his minutes on the floor. These are the kinds of numbers that don't make highlight reels and don't trend on social media, but they absolutely show up in the win column when you track them properly. The possession efficiency numbers for the Knicks when Towns was operating as an offensive hub at the elbow and high post positions were notably strong throughout the playoff run. When he handled the ball in those spots, opposing defenses faced a genuinely impossible statistical choice. Leave him open, and he's shooting at the kind of percentage that makes that an automatic bad decision. Send help, and his assist numbers show he'll find the open teammate with regularity, switch a smaller defender onto him, and his interior scoring efficiency and post numbers make that an equally losing proposition. Those numbers created a situation where the Knicks were generating good shots at a high rate simply because of where Towns was positioned and what he was threatening to do with the ball, which is exactly what elite offensive hub players do statistically. The defensive rating numbers against Wemby in the finals were particularly striking from a statistical standpoint. Wemby is a generational talent at 7'4" with shooting range and shot creation ability that makes him statistically one of the hardest players in basketball to guard at any position. The fact that Towns' defense numbers held up in those matchups, that the Knicks weren't hemorrhaging points when Towns was the primary defender on Wemby, represents a statistical outcome that would have seemed completely unrealistic based on the Towns from 5 or 6 years ago. The defense metrics in those Wemby matchup possessions were competitive, and for a player with Towns' defensive history, competitive against Wemby in the finals is genuinely impressive from a numbers perspective. The per-game statistical comparison between Minnesota Towns at his peak and Knicks Towns in the 2026 playoffs shows two completely different players in terms of overall impact, even if some of the raw scoring numbers look similar on the surface. Minnesota Towns produced elite offensive numbers with negative defense contributions and high foul totals that limited his minutes. Playoff Towns in 2026 is producing strong offensive numbers, career-high playoff assist numbers, improved defense metrics, dramatically lower foul numbers, and team impact statistics that rank near the top of all postseason players. The total statistical picture is fundamentally different, even when individual scoring numbers might look comparable. His playoff scoring efficiency in these playoffs stayed at levels that most centers would take as their primary offensive output. He wasn't sacrificing offensive production to add the other elements. He was adding the other elements on top of maintained offensive production. That's the statistical combination that makes the overall profile so valuable and so different from what his numbers showed in Minnesota. It's not a trade-off story where he gave up one thing to get another. The offensive numbers stayed elite, and the other numbers got dramatically better simultaneously. The team's overall performance, with Towns as the centerpiece of their playoff rotation, reflected all of these individual statistical improvements in the win-loss column. Minnesota Towns produced incredible individual numbers for years, without consistently translating those numbers into deep playoff runs. New York Towns in the 2026 playoffs is producing the best winning basketball of his career statistically, while also putting up some of the most complete individual numbers of his career at the same time. The individual stats and the team success are finally pointing in the same direction, which is something that couldn't be said about most of his Minnesota seasons. Despite all the impressive individual production, his rebounding numbers throughout the playoff run contributed meaningfully to the Knicks' ability to control possessions. Offensive rebounds leading to second chance points, defensive rebounds triggering fast break opportunities, box out numbers that showed commitment to the physical battles inside that had sometimes been questioned during his Minnesota career. The rebounding statistics weren't dramatically different from his career numbers, but the consistency and the timing of those rebounds in high leverage playoff moments reflected the maturity and discipline that the other statistics were also showing. The career statistical arc, when you lay it all out, is one of the more remarkable individual transformations the league has seen from an established star player. 2015, through the early 2020s. Historic offensive production, elite shooting numbers, historic three-point contest win, multiple all-star appearances based on offensive output. Alongside all of that, consistently negative defense on off-splits, league-leading personal foul totals, and postseason numbers that didn't match the regular season production. Then the gradual shift during the final Minnesota seasons, as usage changed and defensive discipline started improving. Then the New York arrival and the continued improvement in the defense, metrics, and foul numbers. Then the 2026 playoffs, where the assist numbers doubled, the triple-doubles came, the defense metrics reached career levels, and the overall impact statistics ranked near the top of all postseason players league-wide. That progression from historically dominant offensive center with significant statistical liabilities on defense to efficient secondary scorer with improving two-way numbers to playoff playmaker and legitimate two-way contributor with career-high impact metrics isn't something that happens automatically with age and experience. The numbers show real change in real statistical categories across multiple years, and that change accelerated dramatically in the 2026 postseason in a way that pushed his overall statistical profile into a completely different category than where it was even 2 years ago. Towns' career numbers through his Minnesota tenure represented one of the most unique and contradictory statistical profiles the league had produced in years. The offensive numbers were historic for his position. The defense numbers were a consistent liability. The combination created endless analytical debate about what his presence on the floor was actually worth in total, because the positive and negative numbers were both significant enough that reasonable analysts could land in very different places depending on which side of the statistical profile they weighted more heavily. The 2026 playoff numbers have largely resolved that analytical debate, at least for this moment in his career. The statistical contributions are spanning both sides of the floor. The efficiency is holding up in a reduced role. The playmaking numbers reach levels that nobody predicted based on his career trajectory. The defense performance contributed to a championship-level team's success in measurable ways. The foul numbers stayed disciplined in the highest pressure basketball environment. And all of those things happen simultaneously, which is the statistical combination that separates this version of Towns from every previous version the numbers had shown us. For nearly a decade, Karl-Anthony Towns' statistics told a story of elite offensive production that couldn't quite be fully celebrated because of what the other numbers showed. During the 2026 playoffs, the numbers finally started telling a complete story. Both sides of the ball, career-high playmaking, maintained offensive efficiency, improved defense metrics, lower fouls, higher overall impact. That's the statistical profile of a player who's still getting better, still adding to his game, and still finding new ways to make the numbers reflect more complete basketball than they ever have before.